All right. So thank you for all of you who've joined us up to this point, and perhaps those of you who might be joining us at a later date in a recorded fashion to this panel, Just Purchasing Consortium, supporting food workers with university purchasing. My name is Patrick Dixon. I'm a researcher at the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labour in the Working Poor at Georgetown, and I'm joined here by my colleagues, Marta Ojeda, who's the worker outreach coordinator on this project, by Mark Biedlingmeyer from the University of California, and Robert Stumberg from the Georgetown Law School. And you're going to hear from all of those people quite shortly. In terms of present, each of us is going to talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'd like to have as positive a discussion as we can, or critical if that's the case. So we'll invite you to raise your hands or put questions in the chat if that's your preferred mode. Just to begin with, I'd like to give a short intro to this project and talk about why we've been spending the last couple of years thinking about the idea of a purchasing consortium. I think if you're someone who's attending an LRAN conference, then I probably don't need to spend too much time discussing the limitations of federal agencies in protecting the safety of workers. Just to give an example, the United States Department of Labor is dwarfed by the US Department of Agriculture, and yet both are to some degree captured by industry or starved of resources, in spite of the best efforts of many dedicated civil servants. At a state level, Osha was designed in such a way that certain states could go above and beyond the limitations of the federal program and introduce increased and enhanced standards. And while some states have opted to do that, other states like Georgia, North Carolina, Florida have used their own state agencies to under-enforce regulations and to provide a lax approach to workplace safety, almost as a calling card to encourage investors to come to their states. In terms of consortia, this isn't an idea that's brand new. Over the past couple of decades, we posit that organizations like the Workers' Rights Consortium the Workers' Rights Consortium in the apparel sector, and Electronics Watch, which is largely based in Europe but deals with computer hardware, have had some measurable effect in improving the sort of guardrails protecting workers within industries. Why are we looking at universities as purchasers? Well, I'd start off with just the fact that this is, in some ways, those of us that are working here, this is our home terrain, that this is an arena that we're familiar with the politics of, and that this is where we work. At the same time, though, universities, I think it's demonstrated, are somewhat, at least on a certain level, comfortable with the idea of consortia, and have demonstrated they're ready to participate in and work within consortia as a means to clean up and to protect their supply chains. So if we could just skip back briefly, Bob, to the previous slide, the previous map showed universities that participate in the Workers' Rights Consortium, others that participate in the Fair Labor Association, and many you'll see signified by the darker dots that already participate in both. It's an unavoidable part of university's mission, I think, at this point in time, to say that they have to have some level of engagement in sustainability. Almost all universities have sustainability offices with dedicated sustainability officers. Sometimes they're hamstrung, but as a class of professional workers, I think sustainability officers have achieved quite a considerable amount in terms of introducing measures that cut down waste, that protect the environment. Can we go to the next slide, please, Bob? Sorry. Thank you. In connecting universities with local economies so they can support local businesses and cut down on travel miles. And in the areas of food, they've improved nutrition, they've improved animal welfare in many cases. One of the areas that I think university sustainability officers acknowledge is an important part of their supply chain, but they haven't necessarily quite figured out how to address yet, is of course the idea of workers' safety, though, and of workers, this idea of workers' social sustainability. So I think what we're trying to address here, what we've been trying to address, is expanding from those lanes in which universities are already quite strong and opening up a fifth lane that focuses on workers' sustainability in the supply chain of goods going to universities. Universities purchase all sorts of things, of course. We decided we would start by focusing on food. We can focus on anything at once. I mean, I think food represents, why we're looking at food. I think this has proven to be one of the areas. Sorry, I'm getting mixed up with the slides. Yeah. I guess I'll have to come back to this one. We're looking at food because I think students have demonstrated this is an area in which they're highly engaged, that this, of all the things that universities purchase, this is one in which they've been most willing, in many cases, to exert pressure on university administrators. And food production is often dominated by domestic suppliers, sometimes within less than, sometimes within less than 100 miles of university campuses to which they're providing. We've also focused on food because even statistics from the Bureau of Labour Statistics, the BLS and Osha demonstrate that food workers are disproportionately face risks of hazards of injury and illness. That's even before COVID. So this chart here, you'll just see that compared to the mean average for industries as a whole in the US, food industry workers are at greater risk. During the COVID era, of course, these were some of the most dangerous workplaces. Research has often also shown, I don't know if anyone was able to attend, anyone here who was in person was able to attend the panel earlier, but research has often shown that within the food sector, it's often people of color and people from historically marginalized communities that are often facing these, often occupy these jobs and often face this disproportionate danger and risk within the workplace. Now, just finally, we're going to look at poultry in particular. We're interested as a whole in the full basket of goods that universities purchase to provide in their cafeterias, in their restaurants, in their canteens. But we can't focus on everything at once, and we decided that poultry would be an important place to start. I suspect many of you are familiar to some degree already that poultry is one of the most dangerous areas of food production, that workers face relentless line speeds that carry great risk of ergonomic injuries, that there's a perpetual risks of cuts, of slips, of falls, that even recent Government Accountability Office reports and reports by Human Rights Watch have raised concerns about the risks of chemical burns. Workers are often deprived the ability to attend the bathroom when they most need to. And of course, as has been made abundantly clear, workers in these facilities were not just at risk of COVID, but are evidently at risk of the transmission of other diseases as well, due to the industrial design of these workspaces. while there are, we've, in addition to this, I'd say we're focusing on poultry because poultry is obviously the #1 protein in the US right now. It's more popular than meat or pork. And while we don't yet quite have the research, I'd say, to prove this in detail, I think we believe that for young people, poultry as a protein makes up an even greater proportion of their daily diet as compared to meat and pork than as the population as a whole. That's something we'd like to prove with further research. In spite of all these adversities or disadvantages, I suppose, in terms of the sort of massive consolidation within these industries, there are certain advantages, though. The Food Safety and Inspection Service, which is part of the USDA, requires all facilities that produce and prepare live meat, poultry, eggs to register. And so there's a database. You can tell by looking at the packaging of any meat product where in the country that food product was produced. So in putting together this consortium, we realized that as a university, Georgetown, we're fairly limited in our heft, even if we include our friends from the University of California, that this isn't necessarily enough to move major players within an industry. However, we've posed the question, well, what if we could have 500 what if we could organize 50 universities with $500 million of purchasing power? Could we move the industry then? Finally, the point I'll leave it is, as much as we might study and research and show and attentively try and follow these industries, we as employees of universities, as faculty at universities in some cases, shouldn't be the people to be speaking on behalf of workers in terms of what their priorities should be. This type of project, I think, can only really work if we use the sort of leverage that we have as purchasers to mobilize that behind the leadership of workers organizations in the form of unions, sometimes in the alt labor sector. I'm now going to pass over to Marta, who's going to talk a bit more about that.
Thank you, Patrick. My name is Marta Ojeda, and I'm the outreach coordinator from the JOS Purchasing Consortium that I'm going to refer as JPC. And before this opportunity, I was working in a network of poultry and meat packing workers, a national coordinator of Beyond Osha project, and also a national coordinator in interfaith worker justice, where I was coordinating 32 worker centers in my portfolio. But in addition to that, I was director many years for a worker center. So this opportunity of the JPC for me, it's something that we can build different. It's an opportunity in order that we can learn from the models that are there, what is working, but also what we can do different. And the first thing that we need to do is try to create a participatory process, because worker centers and workers, they really organize in an horizontal way. And the participatory process is, they are referring to the decision-making process. They are referring to be on the table, not just to be listened, not just to be inclusive, but with equity, where they can be part since the starting point in the design and the implementation, and also in the evaluation of the project. They use often the words that the Zapatistas were using about nothing without, about us without us, meaning that they require that they need to be in the decision-making process in order that will be a workers-led, that we listen, that we will be open, and we understand what are their priorities, not assuming that they need the right to organize or something else when they need another priority. So in order to do this process, we need to map who is there, what they are doing, and what we are talking about. And with this map, you can see we were mapping 7 states where are really concentrates the poultry and meat packing. You can see the symbol of the chicken, where is the 3 major companies, as we know, is Tyson, is Pilgrim, which is part of JBS, and is Sanderson Farm that now is going to be acquired by Cargill, which will be another major company in poultry. But also you can see about the concentration in meat, in that is a JBS and a Smithfield. The stars means the worker centers. So they are organizing, they are resisting, and they are trying to change the situation from the field. The blue circles is the union, the United Food Commercial Workers, because some plants of Tyson are unionized. And the red circle in Alabama is the retail and wholesale department store union, which unionize whey farm companies in Alabama. The symbol that you see right here, like the justice symbols, is all the attorneys, law firms that they are being involved organizing, trying to pursue some changes in public policy and ergonomics, especially. In the hand spraying that you see are the shareholders and the companies who are private, and they are being working with all these workers, and also with these stakeholders organization that is these circles with several colors that you can see here. That is the Food Chain Workers Alliance, the Worker Justice Alliance in California, the Worker Justice Alliance in Texas, Beyond Osha in Texas, and also the Alliance for Fair Food in California, and the Poultry Coalition that has been bringing all these organizations trying to change the situation. They have been doing a lot of resource reports, they are been investigating, they are been organizing in many levels, and unfortunately, nothing has been changed. The workers are been visiting and meeting with the Secretary of Labor, with Osha, with the USDA, with the people of Congress. They are been demonstrating at the White House, wearing diapers because the workers are not allowed to go to the restroom. They are being meeting with everyone that is possible in order to make some change. This organization, they were producing reports since 2009. IPOLSEED, Southern Poultry Law, Oxfam Foundation, they were producing all these reports about the ergonomic injuries, the chemicals impacts, and so on. Unfortunately, all the labor agencies, they are not being able, willing to really enforce the standards. Meaning that if we put the enforcement in the hands of the government, nothing is going to change. It's been years that the Government Accountability Office has been recommending, directing to OSHA, to USDA, to FICES, to all the government agencies, some recommendation specific about the access to the bathroom breaks. 5 years after, OSHA was saying, oh, this is still open and we are developing an alliance with the company trying to develop some materials, when they are not being reviewing the policy for the access for bathroom breaks in 30 years. So the last report of the Congress in May 12 related to the impact of COVID is an evidence of how the government agencies, they were protecting companies' interests instead of workers. So now JPC is an opportunity. It's a platform to do something different, to bring all this expertise for all these many labels, but trying to build this participatory process where workers will be on the table since the beginning, where they can provide some input about the needs, about the priorities, and about they provide leaderships and the campaigns, and try to use this leverage and this power, buying power of the university and also of the students mobilizing and bringing everyone to the table to try to build collective power in an horizontal way that will be with equity, with transparency, and with accountability. For this, we need everyone on board. We need a lot of support. We need a lot of expertise right there. Out there is a lot of expertise. There are many people who can join us and help us. And we are really excited with this opportunity to build something different in a collaborative way, because collaboration is based in relationship. Relationships are based in trust. And we want to build this trust with the workers as the foundation of this project. So you're welcome. I hope that you can join us. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. I think we're going to Mark next.
Hello, everyone. Once again, yes, my name is Mark. I'm a graduate student at the Berkeley School of Public Health out here in California, and I'm working alongside Dr. Sapna Tatatil, who's our Associate Director of Sustainability at our system-wide Office of the President. And really grateful to be working with our Georgetown colleagues for the past year, and excited to jump into some of these supply chain findings that we've come up with. So happy to jump right on in here. And so just a quick overview, I just wanted to talk about and orient you on California if you are unfamiliar. In terms of the UC system, we educate hundreds of thousands of students each year. We're the third largest employer in California, and we also support ag and natural resource research and extension activities with our farming communities across the state. And with all this into consideration, it's pretty apparent we have a responsibility as a public university to advance social and environmental sustainability aspects of our food systems. So in terms of system-wide sustainability, where once again, where my fellowship is housed, our office, shown in light blue square there on the right, coordinates the Sustainable Steering Committee, which engages 13 working groups, including but not limited to food service, procurement, DEIJ, among others. And together they govern our system-wide policy on sustainable practices, which outlines a lot of goals and keeps tracks of different metrics to make sure we're in alignment with those goals. And so all of this is to say our structure can be quite complex. We're juggling a lot of campus level and system-wide policies, but we have substantial topic expertise and numerous leverage points for progressing food systems change. And so, I've really been readily able to connect and glean insights from various leaders throughout these spaces because I work in the Office of the President. And what you see here is a list of interviewees accompanied by their role and affiliation on our campus. And so our goal for these interviews was generally to understand how purchasing decisions are made and what's influencing them. And so naturally, our discussions ranged from business models for food procurement, purchasing volumes and amounts for poultry to kind of get a handle on what's coming in and out, among other topics. And what I learned specifically is that UC food service comes in all shapes and sizes, no surprise, right? There are various providers and distributors catering to each campus. Staffing structure may include a sustainability role or not. Northern California campus could engage with a particular group purchasing organization, whereas a Southern California campus could participate with another. And so once again, pulling some information, those interviews you see in that left table there are just some metrics on the dollars spent and pounds purchased from those various UC locations. And as you can see, there's still some gaps, but we think this helps us understand how pricing may vary from campus to campus and help us begin to ask more questions, right, about, what's influencing these price changes. Could there be different points that we could learn from, different intervention points? And on the right, you can see that we overlaid the locations of major processing facilities from those who serve our campus over with the different locations of our UC campuses. And so this is just to highlight some of the geographic relationships between Foster Farms, also Mary's Chicken, some of their processing facilities with, for example, the Merced campus, which is located there in the Central Valley. And so seeing these spatial relationships can help us guide future work by helping us understand where potential regional alignments can be made between these UC systems and potential labor allies located or near poultry processing facilities. So similar to that map that Marta had shown earlier. And this is certainly quite a busy slide here, so apologies, but I just wanted to kind of demonstrate another resource that I've been putting together to help me understand, once again, kind of the inputs and outputs to, everything happening with the who, the where, the how much of system-wide poultry. And so this is some data from 2019 and some of the stuff from my interviews that we've put together. And overall, it helps us, if you take a step back and look at it, visually understand how UC can be decentralized in some aspects, for example, with maybe a specific poultry contract, but yet maybe centralized in others, demonstrating that a cross-cutting strategy is in order really to make change here. And so ultimately, we're hoping to identify mechanisms influencing system-wide aspects of that supply chain, which I will circle back to with more detail on the end of the presentation. And so that was on a system-wide level, right? And now this is just a deeper look into a campus-specific example with our UCLA campus as a brief little case study. And so the table here highlights various food service providers and business models, which cruelly illustrates some various avenues for which poultry can make its way on campus, demonstrating a variety in scale between food service providers, right? Between UCLA Dining Service, for example, and Associated Students UCLA, what you see there highlighted in the red block. And ASUCLA is an independent nonprofit org housed on campus, and it has a few unique aspects of it, which is why we think it might be a great potential ally. As you can see, they cater to a much more manageable amount of consumers. So, they could possibly be more adaptable with working with smaller, more progressive food suppliers, right? But also, some background here, they're also a key ally here because they manage our code of conduct for trademark licensees, which was a policy driven by largely student activism, which addresses ethical labor standards for companies that sell products with UC branding in the apparel sector. Once again, value alignment and, looking to the future, maybe we can kind of scaffold some of their operations and kind of build in and incorporate some of the work that the Just Purchasing Consortium is set out to do. And so looking ahead, what's next on our plate? We got 1 year down. We feel it's been very productive, but as most things go, once you start learning a little bit about something, you have a ton more questions. And so something we want to start with is student activism. They've played a historical role in progressing change at our UC system, but what are the ebbs and flows, right, as they graduate? Some of them are on a 4-year timeline, right? Undergrads, graduate students are on a 2-year timeline. Beginning to map out academic centers, courses, programs, extracurriculars, focusing on labor. And so, how can we loop them into the fold to address abusive treatment of workers in not, only the supply chain, but their supply chain specifically? Marta really elaborated on this really good, but the labor organizers, it's essential to have their participation in making this change. And these are communities, right? These we see them as our communities as part of a public university, right? How can we incorporate and start communications with different unions, worker centers, labor allies, et cetera, kind of strategically near these campuses that we have? And last but not least, real quickly, Procurement Tools. Just wanted to mention how We believe group purchasing organizations and price index tools play a role in procurement, but the conditions in which we participate and the benefits are still a bit unclear. And so looking into how we can utilize our existing tools such as CalUsource, which manages contracts, how can we use that to support contract managers in enforcing ethical labor practices? And with that, I just want to say thank you, and I'll pass it back off to Patrick.
Thank you very much, Mark. We're now going to go to Bob Stumberg. Bob is a professor at the Georgetown Law School and with the Howson Institute for Public Policy.
Thank you, Patrick. So as Patrick described in his introduction, our ultimate aim is to harness university purchasing power as a source of leverage, which, working shoulder to shoulder with worker organizations such as worker centers and unions, we can enable them to achieve their aims of promoting a decent and healthy workplace. Through their own bottom-up power, we think of ourselves as a complement, as one of two hands clapping, as the purchaser at the other end of the transaction where workers are pushing up from the bottom. Universities are large-scale wholesale purchasers buying up from that supply chain. So we think that purchasing power like that can be a high source of leverage, but it's going to take time. This is a decade or longer project to achieve the scale necessary for purchasing power. In the meantime, however, we can build a foundation brick by brick that creates other kinds of leverage. Our colleague, Mark Pierce, is keen on the subject of collateral enforcement with state and federal agencies. So we see ourselves as partners in an ecosystem of labor, welfare, and compliance. But the one I want to talk about in particular right now is transparency. One of the legacy lessons from the Worker Rights Consortium is that even though universities only accounted for 1.5% of market share for apparel when they first began putting the WRC together, they nonetheless were able to effectively mediate conflicts and help workers get decent working conditions all around the world in global supply chains. And it was transparency that gave them that leverage. It was the reputation risk to the brand that they were able to achieve by staying true to their original promise of making sure that every supplier had to disclose every location. So let me jump in. I'll pause just for a second as I get the slides back on and talk to you about what we mean by transparency. In the short term, we're focusing, as I said, brick by brick on putting together a foundation for developing that capacity. And so we're looking at disclosure of locations of facilities and workers, the proximity of universities to workers and their organizations, OSHA inspections and how they correlate with industry locations, and finally, in the short term, gaps in industry reporting, which also then results in gaps in government data. So Patrick already referenced the Food Safety and Inspection Service. The gray dots on this map indicate the big ones. These are the locations where there are 500 or more employees. So now we can use this as a template and layer on top of it other information such as universities. Again, this is the same data Patrick showed you. The blue, green, and dark blue dots are universities that are either members of the Fair Labor Association or the Worker Rights Consortium, or both. So these universities have already committed themselves to supporting decent work in the context of global supply chains for apparel. And this would be the natural starting point for our campaign to engage universities. Indeed, we've already talked to programs and administrators at about 25 universities. I just put some circles on this map so you could see how many large-scale poultry processing facilities are within driving distance of these universities. And the answer is dozens, if not several dozen. This proximity is the starting point for outreach and organizing, obviously. We also, just as an exercise, put together two maps, again, the large processing facilities as compared to the last several years of OSHA inspections. And we were just doing this as a map making exercise, and then we realized the pattern. take a second to take this in. How many of the red X's, those are the OSHA inspection sites, correlate with the gray dots, which are the biggest poultry processing facilities? The vast majority don't. In other words, OSHA's resources are going to places other than where the industry is most concentrated in terms of its workers and its capital assets. That raises a number of interesting questions that we now want to pursue. What are the priorities for the OSHA inspections? How does the previous administration's 4 years of incessant industry intermingling, how has that affected OSHA and its priorities for inspections? And to what extent is there a different climate in some facilities that might actually make it more likely workers would complain and go to OSHA, as Marta was talking about earlier, as compared to the most concentrated large facilities where workers might be the most intimidated or chilled? Finally, let me talk about gaps in industry reporting. I know this sounds dry, but it gets to the core of industry capture and the risk that the government is actually doing the PR work of the industry. So let's start with a baseline. On the right, you can see a table that reflects two facts. One is that the industry reported data shows a downward trend, which is progress, that is, in terms of an improving health and safety record. The other thing that it says is that meat processing and poultry processing are relatively close in terms of their records of illness and injury. Now compare that with a study done a year ago by researchers in California who looked for the correlation between a processing facility and community spread of COVID. And what they found was comparing a county that has a pork, beef, or poultry facility in it to those counties which do not, a pork plant raised the degree of community spread by 160% in the first several months after the outbreak began. Beef was also high, 110%. Poultry, interestingly, was only 20%. So what does that suggest? What kind of research questions does that raise? There's been a fair amount of media attention to the actual practices of poultry facilities, both on a national scale, as done by the FERN network, Food and Environment Reporting Network, where Leah Douglas did groundbreaking work, and the Los Angeles Times, which covered Foster Farms in California during the first year of the pandemic. And these reports suggest, at least anecdotally and to some extent on a statistical scale, that there might be reasons other than the fact that the poultry industry is somehow better, safer, or more attentive to workers' health needs. So this is the Leah Douglas FERN data, where she showed by the bubble map the locations of outbreaks at meat packing or poultry facilities, and by the size of the bubble, the scope of it. So let's overlay this information with the location of the facilities. And much like the OSHA data, you see the pattern. The vast majority of the largest processing facilities are not ones that reported a COVID outbreak. Does that mean that they didn't have any? Does that mean that the agencies, some agencies at least, knew that they had outbreaks, but were not passing the information on up the statistical food chain to the CDC or other regulators? And take into account the fact that there's this huge disparity also between pork and beef, which was centered in the Midwest, versus poultry, which has a center of gravity in the Southeast. Could the answer perhaps be the political influence and the structure of regulation that's been influenced over the past several decades by the poultry industry in a way that's more beneficial to poultry than one could say for beef or pork? A final anecdote reinforces our hypothesis that industry influence deserves closer scrutiny, and it ought to be a research priority of our consortium. So back in June of 2020, workers started complaining to the Merced County, California Health Department, and the health department began urging strenuously that Foster Farms in their Livingston, California plant start testing workers and taking preventive measures immediately. Foster Farms was very slow to do so. So in late June, the health department urgently asked Foster Farms to report on the status of COVID cases. And on August 12th, Foster Farms reported to the county all their known cases, which were either active or resolved. Those were the only two categories. There were no reported deaths by the company. The workers, however, assured the health department that there were a number of deaths because colleagues knew that their co-workers had died. And so on August 13th, Merced Health asked Foster Farms to report all the known deaths. And a week later, the Foster Farms reported data, which was changed to indeed reveal that 7 of those cases were resolved only in the sense that the worker had died. That's what they meant by resolved. So this suggests that industry practice, hand in hand with government acquiescence, can indeed explain some of the what might appear to be a better record of the poultry industry. So in the long term, we think that the anecdotes pile up to be somewhat of a mountain that deserves closer scrutiny. To what extent is there systemic undercount of rates at Osha and the Department of Labor? And to what extent does it mean that the agencies, wittingly or not, have essentially become a statistical mouthpiece for the industry? Also, in the long term, it'll take us years to develop the capacity to map most university supply chains. California is our leader in terms of developing the methodology for doing exactly that. We also hope to advance transparency in terms of opportunities for leveraging the purchasing power of universities that are using the same suppliers in the same locations. And finally, we hope to work into that scheme opportunities to work with pro-competitive suppliers, that is, new market entrants who are willing to treat their workers with respect and dignity. So with that, Patrick, I'll pass it back to you. And just note, folks, if you want to contact us for the slides or any other sources of information, these are the email addresses you can use. Patrick is there in person at Morehouse, and I'd be happy to take your request as well at my Georgetown address.
Thank you very much, Bob, and thanks again to all of those of you who have stuck with us this far. No one has abandoned us. We very much welcome any comments or questions that people might have, criticisms, however you wish to put it. I think we have about 10 or 15 minutes or until they kick us out. So please. Okay, we have a question in the text from Suzanne Wall. Suzanne, would you like to ask the question yourself, or would you prefer I read it?
I can unmute. Thanks, brother. So I worked with the Mass Teachers Association, which represents about 115,000 workers in Massachusetts, the biggest union in New England. And we also represent the UMass system, which is really proud of their food service, as well as the labor schools and really interesting centers on occupational health and safety, mostly at UMass Lowell. So the question is, how can I help hook up my former MTA comrades? And they have a whole health and safety coalition of about 16 unions with the campaign.
Thank you, Susan. Bob, would you like to take a shot at that?
I'll tee you up, Patrick. We've met with our friends at UMass at the labor centers, at least 2 of the campuses. So we know that your bench is deep. And we hope to set up a process by which we pull everyone together starting next fall in a series of monthly get-togethers where we'll focus on one topic at a time for a deep dive. So we'd love to pull folks at UMass labor centers to see what they have to share that they think is most relevant for building up our capacities as a consortium. But you're an expert too, and so we'd like to know what you what your research interests are and how you think that a consortium can complement bottom-up worker power by changing the environment for large-scale purchasing.
Yeah, I'll send you contacts with the occupational safety and health folks. They sometimes are not in the loop with the labor centers, so it's just another tool in our toolkit. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just, I guess I'd add on that we've met with Steve Striffler, who I believe teaches at the labor school. There's a few other people I know at the labor school through the sort of labor history network, but occupational health and safety is not an area we've been in contact with, so that's definitely valuable. We'd welcome any other questions or comments.
Or I can go into professor mode and start cold calling people. Eric would be first. He's not taking the bait.
He's not there.
Please, Kevin. Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much for talking to everybody. I might have missed this if you covered it before, but it seems like there's a lot of work involved in gathering data on the different types of folks, and then also the monitoring to make sure that as purchasing gets shifted towards more ethical folks, that they continue to do ethical things. So what sort of data collection, processing, analysis things do you have in place to make sure that you're buying from the right folks, that they stay the right folks as it goes forward?
We have several work streams, one of which we're calling our standards or purchasing code. A purchasing code is only one way to use a clear-eyed standard of what decent work or just work looks like, Kevin. So standard setting is part of the process, and we look forward to merging with the worker centers that MARTA is pulling together so that we can begin exchanging views on specific standards. And by that, I mean the conventional standards you're used to seeing in terms of like the Worker Rights Consortium, so the core labor standards in compliance with wage and hour law on the state or national level. But we're adding new items to those standards that are not that don't appear in existing codes. For example, employer extortion. And we've studied the states that look specifically at defining their criminal code in terms of extortion with reference to the immigration status of a worker. 5 states do that, including the progressives in California and the conservatives in Virginia. So there's an interesting spectrum on a topic like that. And OSHA is deeply interesting to us because, as the workers themselves express, getting paid is one thing, but having your life at risk and your family's life at risk because of these disease vectors is quite another. So following the advice of the various worker reports that Marta alluded to in her presentation, we're picking up where they left off. We have a team of medical students at Georgetown who are putting together the literature on how to fix those risks. In other words, it's not just the disease vectors or the harms, but what are the preventive actions that you can take? And then with respect to OSHA, there are several huge gaps that we're going to focus on so that we can put forth a standard to fill that gap. Heat and cold related illness, for example, which is obviously a big issue for hot, steamy factories or folks working in the fields. Ergonomics is the leading, most prevalent cause of injury to workers in poultry and meat packing facilities. There's a gap in the OSHA standards there, and several others. Marta could go on, but just to stop myself, I'll say we're using a work stream on looking at standards that are most relevant to workers. We will vet our approaches and look at, what's the best practice versus what do workers think is ultimately needed to protect them. And then we'll talk about ways in which we can envision a strategy for not so much enforcement, but putting together a whole system of incentives, contract incentives, purchasing power, transparency, nudges, and co-enforcement strategies, either with the workers themselves, perhaps through litigation, or with state and local labor agencies. It's a bit of a ramble, but I think I touched on it. Kevin, did you want to follow up?
No, I think that's really helpful. Thanks.
So we have received questions or comments from everyone who's in attendance who's not engaged with the project in some way already almost. Thanks for the comment in the chat, Rachel. We'd love to work with the Harry Bridges Center in some way. Marcus, Don Pierce, you just turned your camera on. Do you have something you'd like to add?
Well, all I wanted to say was this was, of course, I'm biased, but was a great presentation. And I wanted to underscore that in addition to the work that we're doing with research and documentation, Bob mentioned before that one of my interests is forging relationships with enforcement agencies, partnerships to bring these agencies into the communities while they have the inclination and appetite to pursue this. And of course, these are ebbing and flowing opportunities because there has to be a political will for that pursuit. Right now, there is to some extent, particularly with the DOL and with the NLRB, and being able to establish community relationships that also utilize the resources of these agencies would be helpful in our ability to provide greater worker protection as we create those standards.
I think we appear to be approaching the end of our time. I'd just like to add, I'm not sure when and if in what format this video might be made available online, but if you're watching this on catch up, let's call it later, and you're working on this and you have a question, or if you have colleagues that you think we should talk to, or you'd like to connect to us in some way, I'll just reiterate that please do feel free to reach out and contact us. Bob can be emailed at stumberg@georgetown.edu. That's STUMBERG. I'm here in Atlanta at the event until Thursday, and I can be reached at pmd47@georgetown.edu. Thank you for those of you who did join us and for your valuable questions and input. Does anyone else have anything to add? Otherwise, I think we should call it quits for today.
Thank you, Patrick, for guiding us through.
All right. I think we're ready to finish, Ruben.
Right. Thanks a lot.
Thank
Have a
you.
good day, everyone.
All right. Take care all.